Okay, so this is class 32 in Touching a City's Soul. Well, let's see. Looks like that, Touching a City's Soul. It's a collection of talks of the previous Rebbe that he said while he was visiting Chicago. So in Hebrew, it's called Bikur Chicago, which means the visit to Chicago, but in English, they called it Touching a City's Soul. So it talks about this particular sikha that we're doing now, sikha, talk, as Debbie was asking earlier with the word sikha. So is from Oad on Shabbos. While he was here over a weekend on Shabbos. It was the 13th of Shvat. And just to review, we're at the very end of this sikha. I think we should finish today. So what it's talking about, it starts off by talking about that Shabbos, which was also called Shabbos Shira, the Shabbos of song, because that week in Shul, that parsha was Az Yashir, which is the song of the sea, that the Jewish people sang as they crossed through the Yam Suf, through the Red Sea on their way out of Egypt. And the Rebbe starts by talking about the Maharal of Prague, who was a very great tzaddik and a very great teacher, and he taught us a lot of Torah, and even almost more importantly than that, he inspired the Jews to keep Torah, mitzvahs, and especially the minhagim, the customs, because the customs become entrenched in a person's heart, and how the custom was to feed the birds on that Shabbos because of the miracle that was done. Now it goes into the whole scholarly essay from there, talks about how every parsha of every week has a message for that week. And in fact, the Torah not just has a message for us, but it continually gives a life to the world and brings the world from non-existence into a state of existence, because Hashem is constantly bringing the world into existence, and Torah has a message and a life force to add to the world, and then goes into this whole idea of the first verse of Torah, which is Bereshis bara Elokim es hashamayim ve'es haaretz. God, in the beginning, God created heaven and earth. How the first word Bereshis, which means in the beginning, can be translated as Beis Reshis for two firsts. The world was created sort of in honor of two firsts. The Torah is called one first. There's a verse that refers to the Torah as the first, and the Jewish people are called the first. They're also referred to as the firstborn of Hashem. So it's because of these two firsts of Torah and the Jewish people that the world was created, and that the 5 books of the Chumash are divided up into 53 parshiyos, one for each week of the year, and the Jew gets an aliyah to the Torah. So that's like the joining of the Torah and the Jew, and how that creates an elevation in all the worlds and helps to support the continuous recreation of the world. And the Rebbe goes on to explain the rest of the pasuk, Bereshis bara Elokim es hashamayim ve'es haaretz. In the beginning, God created heaven and earth. If we're going to retranslate it, that for these two firsts, Torah and the Jew, bara, they reveal, a deeper level of translating that word is to reveal. They reveal Elokim, the godliness, es hashamayim ve'es haaretz, that is hidden within heaven and earth, meaning that the combination of the Jew and Torah, learning Torah, doing mitzvahs, reveals the godliness that's been hidden in creation, in the nature of the world, that even in the nature of the world there is godliness. And the Rebbe explains there's 2 levels of godliness. There's what's called natural divinity and spiritual divinity, that the natural divinity is the divinity that's hidden in the world. The spiritual divinity is the more sort of spiritual godliness that's revealed in the higher worlds. And how our job, I guess, our mission is to reveal the godliness that's hidden in the world. It goes into there and talks about the soul of the person, the soul of the Jew, and how it has the nature of the soul, which explains the nature is a borrowed term, and nature explains what something is, but it can't explain why something is. It can explain how, but it can't explain why. So goes on to say that the nature of the Jewish soul resides in its, or is its source, is in its faculty of Chachma, which is the first of the 10 spheros, which is the receptor for the light of Ein Sof, the godliness that's above all creation. That's where the source of the nature of the Jewish soul is. It resides in the faculty of Chachma, which is like a vessel for the light of Ein Sof. And we're going to put that aside for a second, because we're going to come back to it to analyze it. But that's like a statement. And then the Frierdiker Rebbe goes in to explain how the Torah uses terms that enable us to understand. And there's two levels of that, using terminology that help us understand things. One level is it just brings down the exact idea right down into the world, and another level is that it conceals it as it comes down so that we can understand it better. And that Chassidus helps us to understand and not just to believe in God, but to know that there's a God by the way it explains godliness and creation and everything else. And that it's one of the pillars of our faith that we have to know that there's a God. And the way that we know that there's a God is to do as much learning as we can, not just to believe that there's a God, but to know that there's a God. And therefore, the Torah has to use these two methods of explaining things to us so that we can know something with our intellect, not just believe it with our supra-rational. And that these two knowledges are called the lower knowledge and the higher knowledge, or Das Elyon, Das Tachton. And Das Tachton, the lower level of knowledge, is, starts from the human experience and the human understanding of the world, and then extrapolates outward to godliness, whereas sort of Das Elyon, the higher level of knowledge, starts sort of from God's perspective. So from our perspective, there's a world and we're searching for the godliness. From God's perspective, there's just godliness, and then he contracts himself so that there can be space for a world. So then we go back from there to talk about how we want to explain what does Alter Rebbe mean when he says it's the nature of the soul, the aspect of the nature of the soul. We're talking about the natural divinity level, that lower level of divinity, the lower level of knowledge, like what's available to us from our perspective and from the worldly perspective and so on. And the fact that the Alter Rebbe uses this idea that the nature of the soul starts with the sphera, with the quality of Chachma, it tells us that that's where the progression of the creation of the world begins, from this point of Chachma. Before Chachma is above the order of creation, and from Chachma and below is part of the order of creation. So that's kind of where we got up to. We talked about the fact that this quote that the Alter Rebbe says that that in the nature of the soul is the soul's Chachma, which is the infinite light of Ein Sof. The fact that he adds this terminology in which resides the infinite light of Ein Sof teaches us 10 things, and we were in the middle of those 10 things. But I think I'm gonna start the review like inside from the beginning of those 10 things. So we're gonna start from the bottom of page 145, even though we read that already, but we're gonna review that a little bit. So again, what we're talking about now is that the world is animated and brought into being by this natural divinity level. And when the Alter Rebbe says that the nature of the godly soul is from the sphere of Chachma, that's the beginning of the order of creation. And it continues on into the rest of creation. And anything that's above the Chachma, or the level of Chachma of Atzilus, we're talking about Chachma of Atzilus, is above the natural order of creation. So what we're going to explain now is that original phrase, which is that the source of the soul's nature is its faculty of chachma. So that's why we're saying that first half of that phrase tells us that nature begins with the faculty of chachma. And that faculty of chachma is the receptor for the light of Ein Sof, which is infinite. So it's sort of like telling us two things at once. It's telling us that the nature of the soul starts with chachma, and we already established that nature is something that explains how, but not why. So it's the nature of the soul is from the faculty of chachma, and anything from that point and below is part of the order of creation. But any from that point, above that point, is above the order of creation. It's infinite. And that faculty of chachma is the beginning of the order of creation and the nature of the soul. And at the same time, it's a receptacle, it's a vessel for the levels that are above. So it's like this point of contact between what is above the order of nature and what we were calling perhaps like the godly perspective and the higher than nature and infinite, and nature and the order of creation, which is still all God and godliness, but it's that lower level of godliness that includes itself in nature. So the aspect of chachma of the neshama is that sort of that pivotal point, where from that point begins the nature of the soul and the nature of creation. And from right above that point is like the infinity of Hashem, and the chachma is the receptacle. It's the vessel that includes in it this infinite light of Ein Sof, because we know that the infinite light of Ein Sof has to come into the world in order for the world to be created, but it's through lots more concealments and contractions and so on, in order for it to be called nature, because we just established earlier in the talk that there's natural divinity and spiritual divinity, right? The natural divinity is that which we see and clothed in nature. It has to have a progression that starts with chachma. But the spiritual divinity, and that's not part of the nature of the world, is above that point. So that's where we're holding. So on the bottom of page 145, it says, now Tanya is the chumash of the teachings of Chassidus. Tanya is that what that means is that it's like we call it the written Torah of Chassidus, and in fact today is the 18th of Kislev, which is, we finished learning the yearly cycle of Tanya today. Anybody who does chitas, we make a siyum on Tanya today, and we start learning Tanya again tomorrow. So if anybody hasn't been learning chitas, this is a wonderful time to make a resolution to start learning chitas. Little commercial plug here. At least to start learning the Tanya part, you can listen to oral classes on Chabad.org. You can listen to my husband's classes on Chabad.org. You can listen to Rabbi Gordon's classes. I think Rabbi Gordon and Rabbi Friedman actually have their classes divided by the Tanya of the day. So you can listen to it, according to the breakdown of chitas. You can read it. There's many different forms. There's chitas for kids that you can listen to, which is sort of a more condensed form. But this is a good time to start learning Tanya, since tomorrow morning everybody's starting the cycle fresh. Anyway, so it's called the written Torah of Chassidus because it's the basics of the basis and the foundation of all of the teachings of Chabad Chassidus. Everything from Chabad Chassidus, comes from that. So just as in the written Torah, the letters of its words are precise and the very placement of neighboring statements is significant, the same applies to Tanya. The letters of every word are precise, and one ought to invest deep thought in godly understanding that the Alter Rebbe is revealing to us. So we're going to analyze that description of the soul, the nature of the soul, and the Frierdiker Rebbe is going to tell us we learn 10 things from the added words that it says that it's a receptacle for the light of Ein Sof, that Chachma is a receptacle for the light of Ein Sof. But I think we did 5 of them last week, but we're going to review them because it may be obvious to the previous Rebbe, it's not quite as obvious to us, so we could do with a little review, I think. So the Alter Rebbe tells us that there's the nature of the soul, tells us there in Tanya, that the nature of the soul is the soul's Chachma. That's that we talked about earlier, in which the infinite Ein Sof light abides. So if we're just talking about the nature of the soul, all we need to know is that the nature of the soul is from the soul's chachma. That's all we need to know. At first glance, that phrase appears to be unrelated to what he's explaining at this point. Meaning, why do we need to know that the infinite Ein Sof light abides there? He's explaining the nature of the soul. The infinite Ein Sof light is not part of the nature of anything. It's above nature. So why is that part of that phrase? Because it appears to be unrelated to what he's explaining at this point, namely that the soul's nature is not based on reason, knowledge, and intelligence that can be understood. Rather, it is beyond the grasp of comprehension of rational intelligence. And what is that higher level called, higher than rational intelligence? That's called Chachma, the soul's faculty of Chachma. So that seems to be a full statement. It could have just stopped there. Why did the Alter Rebbe add those few words? However, by adding those few words in which the infinite Ein Sof light abides, the Alter Rebbe explains to us 10 concepts. So these are the 10 things that we learn based on the additional few words of the Alter Rebbe and Tanya describing the nature of the soul. Are we okay so far, ladies? Yeah. Okay. So the first thing, the soul's faculty of Chachma is defined by the fact that that in it the infinite Ein Sof light abides. So since he's mentioning Chachma, and like in one breath, when he mentions Chachma, he mentions in which the infinite Ein Sof light abides. That previous Rebbe is saying that therefore, that means that the faculty of Chachma is defined by the fact that in it the infinite Ein Sof light abides. Otherwise, I guess the Alter Rebbe wouldn't have said it. He wouldn't have included those words if it wasn't part of the very definition of the faculty of Chachma. Right? The faculty of Chachma is defined by the fact that in it the infinite Ein Sof light abides, which actually is understandable in a certain sense, because the inner aspect of Chachma is bittul, is nullification to that which is above it, which is the infinite light of Ein Sof. And Chachma, the idea of Chachma is not about, even though we translate it as wisdom, we say in Torah, who's wise? Somebody who learns from everybody. What does wisdom consist of? Wisdom consists of seeking knowledge where there's knowledge, being open to knowledge. So being open to wisdom. So Chachma is a receptacle for that which is above it. It receives its inspiration from that which is above it. So I suppose that's part of, unlike, the world, which says somebody's, they call somebody wise if they know a lot, not if they're open to knowing more, right? It's like you're supposed to know everything if you're wise. Whereas Torah says, no, nobody ever knows everything. And if somebody thinks they know everything, that's not a sign of wisdom. So Chachma is defined by the fact that in an infinite Ein Sof light abides. It's open to that level above it. Number two, otherwise, so again, it's being that quality is said together with the, right as soon as you say the words that this is where the nature of the soul comes from, right away you say you're defining Chachma and you're including that in it, the infinite light, Ein Sof light abides. So that means it's part of the actual definition of Chachma. Number two, the Alter Rebbe is hinting to us that the soul's faculty of Chachma resembles the sphere of Chachma in the world of Atzilos. And that level of Chachma, he explains in the gloss to chapter 35 of Tanya. I mean, each of the worlds, there's 4 worlds, which the Frierdiker was going to mention at the end of the Sikha, and he mentioned in the middle, or towards the beginning when he was talking about an aliyah to the Torah, effectuates, all 5 levels of the soul, all 4 worlds. There's 4 worlds, and each of the 4 worlds has a full complement of 10 spheres. And the world of Atzilos is the highest world. So each of the 10 spheres, each of these 10 characteristics is connected to the characteristics as they appear in the world above them. And the Alter Rebbe is hinting to us that the faculty of Chachma resembles the sphere of Chachma, that the soul's faculty of Chachma, which is how these 10 qualities reside in our soul, resembles how these qualities are in creation in the macro. They're in the micro, there are soul qualities. In the macro, They're the way that God chooses to put his light into these qualities to create the world. And the first point of creation of the creative process is Chachma Vatzilos, is this quality in the highest world, just like the point of, so to speak, creation of our soul and our bodies, of our soul coming into our bodies for our microcosm, is the soul's quality of Chachma for our soul. So too, like in the global soul of the world, the Chachma Vatzilos is the beginning point of the global soul of the world, the beginning of creation. So there's a parallel, and in general we say there's a parallel between the small man and the world, right? That each individual person's creation mirrors the creation of the world, which is why it says that we were created in the image of God. So the soul's faculty of Chachma resembles the sphere of Chachma in the highest world. That's called the world of Atzilus, which is from the word Eitzel, which means near God. The soul's faculty of Chachma is nature, because it says the nature of the soul is found in its quality of Chachma. The soul's faculty of Chachma is nature, but not like the nature of the created beings of the world. And that is why he first speaks of the nature of the light of a candle. And only then does he speak of the nature of the soul. The latter is also one of the things vested in nature, but it is vested in an utterly different way, because the soul's faculty of Chachma, you guessed it, is a receptor for the infinite light of Ein Sof. So it's nature. We're using the same term nature, but it's not used in exactly, it doesn't mean exactly the same thing as it does with an actual physical created being, because the soul is not a physical thing. That's why it's compared to a fire, a flame of a candle, because the flame is also not an actual physical thing, even though it does impact and sort of reside in the physical world. It does, but at the same time, I think we mentioned this last time, you can't like hold on to it. It doesn't go down. It's not drawn down by gravity. Everything else in the physical world is drawn down by gravity. If you can hold on to it, you can contain it some way. But you can't contain a flame. If you contain it, it goes out. It's not drawn down by gravity, it goes up. It defies gravity. It's the only thing in the physical world that actually defies gravity. So the author is comparing a soul to a flame, not to the nature of a flame, not to the nature of everything else in the created world. Sort of like, again, like a bridge between God and physicality. And the reason why the soul doesn't have the same nature as everything else in the physical world is because it's a receptacle. It's a receptor for the infinite Ein Sof light. So that puts it in a different category. So that's why when he mentions the nature of the soul, he has to say, and it comes from Chachma, which is a receptacle for the infinite light, because that's part of the definition of Chachma that helps us understand what the soul is, and he's trying to describe what the soul is, or what the soul source is. The source of the soul's nature is, to be more specific. Okay, number 4. Now, Rebbe is hinting to us that the nature of the soul, i.e. the soul's faculty of Chachma, basically derives from Yechida, which is the highest level of the 5 levels of the soul, which in turn is connected to the level of Elokus called Yachid, which is this highest level of godliness. Because remember, we talk about the soul mirroring God. So there's the highest level of soul, highest level of godliness. So she's hinting that since it's a receptacle for the light of Ein Sof, it's deriving the nature, even the nature of the soul, which is a lower level of the soul, actually derives from its highest level, which is connected to the highest level of Hashem. Moreover, it becomes revealed not via the successively gradated stages of Hishtalshalos, but by leaping over the low levels of the soul, namely Nefesh, Ruach, Neshama. It becomes revealed not like step by step in the order of creation, but what in a leaping manner, which means it's not, you can't get from here to there, like there has to be a contraction and a jump through, sort of like a breakthrough godliness. Because you can't get from that highest level of God to the physicality just by taking lots of steps. Number 5, even though the infinite Ein Sof light abides in the soul's faculty of Chachma, that faculty is part of nature and does not transcend nature. The infinite light is above nature, but the faculty of Chachma is the first sort of stage of nature. The vessel is part of the order of the chain of creations, but the light it contains is above the order of the chain of creations. Number 6. With the above hints, so if we understand all of the above hints properly, the Alter Rebbe indicates that which transcends Chachma, namely the sphere of Keser, also transcends nature. Meaning, if the quality of Chachma is the beginning of the nature of the soul, that means that anything above nature Chachma transcends nature. What is the vessel, so to speak, that's above Chachma? Not the light that's above Chachma. What's the vessel that's above Chachma? Is Keser. Keser is the crown, right? It's the level that gives birth to the 10 qualities and to the order of creation and everything else, but it is above the natural order of creation, because if Chachma is the beginning of the nature of the soul, then anything above Chachma is above the nature, right? So it's hinting that Keser transcends nature, which of course makes sense, because that's why it's called Keser. One of the ideas that Chachma is compared to one of the aspects of the brain, right? The 3 parts of the brain, 3 parts of the intellect, and in Chassidus, Keser is a crown that sits on top of the head, so it's not something that's internal; it's something that's surrounding. Number 7. The emphasis that Chachma is nature, and that in it the infinite Ein Sof light abides, that's what we've been describing so far, gives us an understanding of the sphere of Keser. Though it transcends nature, it is nevertheless no more than a garment. Because it says in it, it doesn't say the sphere of Chachma in which the light of Keser resides or something like that. It says the light of Ein Sof resides. So Keser is above Chachma, but it's also a garment. It's also a vessel, and it's above nature and everything else, but it's still part of the definition of somethingness, even though it's not really somethingness, but it's that bridge. This leads us to the conclusion that Elokus, that means godliness, vests itself, as it were, in 2 kinds of garments. Garments of revelation, which transcends nature, and garments of concealment, which is nature. It leads us to that conclusion, ladies, in case you were wondering what our conclusion is. That's our conclusion. It leads us to that conclusion. It leads us to the conclusion that there are, and which is what we were talking about before, right? We were talking about before how there's the divinity, the spiritual divinity, and the natural divinity. Godliness encloses itself in garments of revelation and garments of concealment. Garments of revelation transcend nature, which is like Keser, and garments of concealment, which is nature, which starts from Chachma, right? Where the godliness becomes concealed and concealed and concealed in the world. And our job as Jews is to reveal it through Torah Mitzvahs, which is what we said at the very beginning of this whole Sikha. We're trying to, describe the mechanics through which we get to do that, how we get to do that. So there's garments of revelation and garments of concealment. Now, yeah. Are you waving a white flag? Wait, you're muted, so you have to unmute yourself.
No. Okay, here we go. Oh. The reaction is slow. This Sabeh Kalaman and Mamalai Kalaman, is that what he's talking about here? Is this something
That's the very next part. That's the very next point.
Oh, sorry.
You're going to relate that to exactly those 2 ideas. Yep.
And Chachma, the actual faculty of Chachma is not godliness. It's what Chachma contains. That's the godliness.
Well, it's one of the faculties of the soul. I mean, there's an inner and an outer dimension of all the faculties of the soul. It's not Ein Sof, the light of Ein Sof resides in it. Compared to the body, it's godliness, but compared to the light of Ein Sof, it's a vessel. You know, everything is relative.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Because ultimately everything is godliness, right? So like you have to know where you're holding in the I don't know what the word is I'm looking for, and like the chain of definitions, like what point are you talking to know whether you're talking, whether you're talking about a light or a vessel. But the inner light of Chachma is humility. The vessel is Chachma. But here we're saying the light is the light, it resides the light of Ein Sof, and the vessel is Chachma, which is the beginning of the nature of the soul. You're talking about relative to the actual brain, Chachma is divinity versus the brain is the physicality. So a continuum, I guess you could say, in a certain way.
How is that different than Malchus?
Well, Malchus is the 10th of the Sphira. You have to get all the way from Chachma all the way down to Malchus. Each one has its own flavor.
But it also holds and it gives.
Every one of the Sphiras receives and gives. That's how there's a chain of creation, because they all receive and give and receive and give. And what is their main function? Chachma brings new light into the world. That's its main function. Malchus doesn't bring new light into the world. It acts as a container for all the lights above it and absorbs it to give over to the next level of creation, but it doesn't act as bringing a new light specifically. Chachma brings a new light into the world, new light of Ein Sof into the world. Chachma is spiriru. Things are clarified with the quality of Chachma. Malchus is a connector.
Didn't we have a mimer that it showed where it sometimes with Malchus that goes directly from like above Chachma, and it goes like Malchus goes sometimes, I don't remember which mimer.
Malchus becomes Kesser for the world below it.
Okay, all right. Oh, that's right. Okay, thank you.
So it's from but Malchus is the last of the spheres in its world. Once it sort of switches to becoming the giver of birth to the next world, it becomes Kesser for the world below it. It has like a dual nature to it.
Thank you.
But now we're talking about Chachma, which is that point of contact with godliness, with the light of Ein Sof, bringing the light of Ein Sof. Okay, we're up to number 9. Okay, number 9. The first of these garments, the garment of revelation, which transcends nature, just as Malka intuited, is the light that transcends all the worlds, the Or HaSoviv Kol Almin, which is also known as the Or HaMakif. Or Soviv Kol Almin literally means the light that surrounds the worlds, that encompasses the worlds, which that's the Kabbalistic term, and Or Makif is the Hasidic term, which means the light that surrounds all worlds. I mean, it's like Makif is like Hakafas. So when we do Hakafas, when we go around the bima, it means something that's surrounding. So it's a surrounding light, versus a permeating light. So that's the garment of revelation in the spiritual world, is the surrounding light. It's spiritual in its nature. It doesn't have to permeate anything physical, the physical creation, because it's a surrounding light. It's more found in the spiritual levels. The second, the garment that is concealed in nature, or the garments of concealment, which are nature, depending on which phrase of the Sikha we're talking about, is the light that is immanent within all the worlds. That's the light of godliness that's found in every aspect of creation. It's like the soul of each aspect of creation, like the soul of the stone, right? The godliness that brings the stone into existence is like the soul of the stone. That's godliness that's immanent within all worlds. That's called Or HaMimale Ka'amen, the light that fills the world, which is also known as Or Panimi, the inner, internalized light. We also maybe call it in English transcendent light versus permeating light, encompassing light versus internalizing light. So there's the light of God that's larger than any vessel, so to speak. I mean, these are all obviously parable type of terms. We're not really actually talking about physically large or smaller, right? We're talking about non-physical entities, but just as earlier in the Sikha says, we use words that can help us understand something. So just in terms of like the way that we talk about it is we say it's a light that's larger than the vessel. When there's a light that's larger than the vessel revealed, then we're talking about we're in a spiritual world, because you can have a very revealed light. You don't need to have a physical vessel, and you can't actually have a physical vessel because the light's too large to be contained. When you're talking about a light that's imminent and internalizing into a vessel, then you're talking about a level of light that's in the physical world, because by definition, once there's a vessel, then you're in the physicality. Now, of course, there's obviously lots and lots of gradations to this as well, because even spiritual entities have a physical and spiritual aspect to them, and even physical entities have a spiritual and physical aspect to them, right? But we're talking about basically spiritual worlds. Even the quote unquote physicality of the spiritual world is still spiritual compared to us. So like, even though we talk about, let's say angels reside in a spiritual world, that there's a physical aspect of angels and a spiritual aspect to angels within their own world, like the vessel and the light, but their vessel is not physical the way we would describe physical. So it's just physical compared to their light. You know, it's anyway, that's really not really what, I don't think that's not really what he's talking about right here, what the previous are talking about here. But that concept is that the spiritual worlds have a revealed godliness that's called this surrounding light of Hashem, and the physical worlds, their godliness is called the permeating light of Hashem, and it's contained in vessels, and therefore also, as he said earlier in the Sikha, it's also therefore it's hidden. It's teva. The word teva, which means nature, means sunken in, drowned. The godliness is drowned in the physicality. It's subsumed within the physicality. You can't see it. You have to extract it. So it's not as obvious. So that's why it's called concealed godliness, versus in the spiritual realms, the godliness is revealed, and it's larger than a vessel, which is why it's not a physical world. There can't be a vessel to contain it. So there isn't a physical vessel. It's a spiritual world. That level of godliness is just rampant, so to speak, in the spiritual world. Our level of godliness is that godliness that's sunken into the physicality of the world, and that's why it's called concealed, because it's not obvious. We have to go looking for it. It's not obvious level of godliness. Are we okay?
Chaya?
Yeah.
The term permeating, that seems to me like that would be internalized.
Correct.
But it seems like you were saying that it's surrounded. Oh,
No.
okay. So the permeating light is Mamale Kol Almin.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. So now, sorry if I missaid that at some point. So now the 10th point. Two consequences that evolved below, meaning in our creation, from these two kinds of garments, in which Elikos, so to speak, vests itself, are natural divinity and spiritual divinity. Like we said earlier, right? This he talked about this idea before. Now he's putting all the pieces together. And he's saying that's what we meant when we said natural divinity and spiritual divinity. Spiritual divinity is that surrounding light transcending the order of creation, and natural divinity is that permeating light that descends into creation. We are supposed to be revealing that. That's how we started this whole thing, was we have to reveal it through our connect Torah, and the Jewish people are supposed to be revealing this. That's like our mission. So he spent a very long time giving us the mechanics of what we're supposed to be, what like the background of the mechanics of what that means, basically. And these 10 things, that's what we learn from that extra line. So he quotes what the nature of the soul is from the Alter Rebbe, and then starts to explain, what does that mean? What does that mean? What does that mean? What does that mean? How do we get there? How do we get there? How do we get there? And, on this whole definition. Now, from those 10 things, there's another 4. There's another 4 points that we can understand. Meaning, these 10 things we learn from that phrase, that Chachma, in which the infinite Ein Sof light abides. Now, all these 10 things help us understand 4 more points. From the above brief clarification on how Chassidus explains the concepts of nature and beyond nature, so that's what we've been doing, nature and beyond nature, we've been describing what it is according to Chassidus, we can understand 4 points. Point number 1. The connection between all the soul levels, which the Alter Rebbe hints at in the above quoted statement in Tanya, that the soul's nature is not based on reason, knowledge, and intelligence that can be understood, but rather is beyond the grasp and comprehension of rational intelligence. To use the terms that appear in descending order in the original Tanya, right? It's not based on reason, which the word is tam. So it's not based on tam, it's not based on reason, alludes to the soul level called Yechida, that's the highest level of the soul. Vadas, it's not based on knowledge, alludes to the level of Chaya, which is the next level of the soul. It's not based on intelligence that can be understood, alludes to that Seichel, that alludes to the level of the Neshama, but rather is beyond the grasp, that's the word Musag, that's the level of Ruach of the Neshama, and comprehension of rational intelligence, that's the level of Umuvan, of the Nefesh, meaning that all of these 5 levels are connected. They're all connected, but basically that's what the Alter Rebbe is saying, that these are all connected. The level, the nature, the soul's nature is not based on these 5 levels of understanding, these 5 levels of the soul. The soul's nature is based on the quality of Chachma as the Ein Sof light resides there. Whatever, that's like a definition. It's not, these 5 levels of the soul are all connected to each other, but the nature of the soul is connected to the level of Chachma as the Ein Sof light resides there. The next thing we understand is the connection between the various worlds, Asiya, Yetzirah, Bria, and Atzilos, the sphere of Malchus of Ein Sof, which transcends the world of Atzilos. These are the 4 worlds. There's 5 levels of the soul, which are the Yechida, the Chaya, the Nefesh, the Ruach, the Neshama, the Ruach, and the Nefesh. Those are 5 levels of the soul. And there's 4 worlds and a 5th level, which are the Asiya, Yetzirah, Bria, and Atzilus. And then these 4 levels of the worlds, which 4 levels of creation, there's the level that's higher than Atzilos, which is the lowest level of Ein Sof, basically. Is not usually used as a separate world, but here in this context, he's trying to show how there's 5 levels of the soul and 5 levels of creation. So that 5th level of creation is right above the world of Atzilos, the beginning of definition that goes into Atzilos. And number 3, the connection between, on the one hand, the levels of the soul, and on the other hand, the corresponding levels of the worlds. Meaning, that's what I just said. There's 5 levels of the soul, and he's now showing there's 5 levels of creation. So what he's saying is that the Rebbe is making a connection between the 5 levels of the soul and the 5 levels of creation. But why is this important? Because our original quote was that when a person gets an aliyah to the Torah, there's an elevation in all 5 levels of the soul and also in all the worlds. That was our original quote that we've been trying to explain ever since that day, many weeks ago. So he's putting it together, and he's saying the 5 levels of the soul are related to these 5 levels of creation, the 4 worlds and this level of Malchus above the world of Atzilos. And number 4, as we have seen, the root of the level of natural divinity, which means the level of godliness which is vested in nature, which is the or panimi, the internal light, the indwelling or hamamale, which the kalama, which is the permeating light. So the root of natural divinity, being thus invested in the finite capacity of the recipient, because natural divinity is rooted in the chachma of the neshama, even higher, is now hidden there. So the root of the level of natural divinity is invested in the finite capacity of the recipient, is now hidden there. Nevertheless, it is of a higher spiritual level than the spiritual divinity whose root is the or makif, the transcendent or hasaviv kol almin. This is like a new, it feels like this is a new idea, but he's saying, the Alter Rebbe is hinting, we understand these 4 points, that even though the root of the level of natural divinity, which is that lower level of Hashem, this light, the lower level of Hashem's light, the root of natural divinity is this permeating light. Nevertheless, this is being thus invested in the finite capacity of the recipient. It is hidden there in the hidden levels of godliness. Nevertheless, it is of a higher spiritual level than the spiritual divinity whose root is the or makif, the transcendent or hasaviv kol almin. That the source of this permeating level of godliness is actually higher than the source of the surrounding level of godliness. So that when we say that the root, that in Chachma is the light of Ein Sof, what we're saying is that the natural divinity that is part of the world and part of the soul's nature, and we see in the world, it's even of a higher spiritual level than the spiritual divinity, which is that surrounding light and encompassing light. The source, not the way it presents, but its source is of a higher level, which means that we bring down a very high level of godliness when we do Torah and mitzvahs, basically. I'll read that one. I'll read that one more time, and then he's going to make his conclusion. But let's read number 4 one more time. It says, as we have seen, the root of the level of natural divinity, the level of elokus, which is vested in nature, the love of godliness that's vested in nature, the natural divinity is the godliness that's vested in nature, is the or pnimi, that indwelling or hamimale, that internal light, that light that fills, kol amen, the world. Being thus invested in the finite capacity of the recipient, it is now hidden there. Meaning this godliness is hidden in the recipient. That's why it's called the godliness that's natural divinity hidden in nature. It's hidden in the recipient, which is nature. Nevertheless, it is of a higher spiritual level than the spiritual divinity whose root is or makif, the transcendent or hasaviv kol almin. Nevertheless, this finite godliness, or this level of natural divinity, is of a higher spiritual level than the higher level of godliness, the spiritual divinity. In other words, the source of the natural divinity is of a higher source than the source of the spiritual divinity. So even though we say that the spiritual divinity is a higher level and therefore it can't be contained in physicality, and it's in the spiritual world and it's larger than a vessel, and we say that the natural divinity is in nature and it is contained in the vessel, that's why it's called the permeating light, its source is actually higher. Its source is actually higher, which in other places in Chassidus it explains that's why it can go lower. It can go lower because, quote unquote, it's stronger, as it were. Because its source is higher, it can reach lower. So those are the 4 things that we understand about nature and beyond nature now. Now, the previous Rebbe is going to bring that all the way back to the quote, which is on page 140, that whenever a Jew is called up to the Torah, this ascent is experienced by all the components of his soul, and that each of the levels of the soul ascends to a different world. and that the highest level of the soul ascends to the Torah as far as the sphere of Malchus of Ein Sof that transcends the world of Atzilus, above nature. That's what happens when a person gets called up to the Torah. So we've been explaining that basically this whole time. So now this is his conclusion. The above discussion that we've had for the last few weeks throws light on the statement cited above that whenever a Jew is called up to the reading of the Torah, literally whenever he has an aliyah, an ascent to the Torah, all the levels of his soul ascend to the Torah in all the spiritual worlds. There in the original quote, it explains which level of the soul goes up to which world. As far up, so to speak, as the sphere of Malchus of Ein Sof, which is that level that's above the Chachma Vatzilos, it's above the order of creation, which transcends the world of Atzilus. And that entire ascent takes place in and by means of the weekly Torah reading. Meaning there's a godliness, our soul is affected by the Torah reading, which is what our original point was that we started with, that the Torah and the Jewish soul is the purpose of creation. So, therefore, an aliyah to the reading of the weekly Sedra thus brings the descent of a soul to completion. In other words, the reason why it was brought into this world is you're unifying the soul and Torah, which is the Bais Rashis, going back to the very beginning, the two first that the world was created for, empowering it to fulfill the mission for which God dispatched it into this world. So that interaction, connects the soul and the Torah and affects an elevation in all the worlds and fulfills the soul's purpose for coming into the world. Now, that's basically the end. That is the end of the Sikha. That starts off by talking about how, the special Shabbos, and then the previous service says, and now we're going to explain Shabbos Shira according to Chassidus. This is Shabbos Shira according to Chassidus, basically. This is like the whole idea of the weekly Torah portion, is that it brings light and life force into the world for that week, each one, that week. And when a person gets an aliyah to the Torah, what's called an aliyah, they're going up because there's an ascent of their soul to all the different realms of, creation, which brings together this purpose of, for the two first, the world was created for Torah and for the Jewish soul. He's talking to a group of people. I guess he's trying to encourage them to go to Shul on Shabbos, and I don't know. This idea. Anyway, that's kind of the end of this sikha. We could say chazak chazak v'nischazek.
Chaya, what about all of the multitudes who don't get an aliyah, whether because they're, for whatever reason, whether it's because they're a woman or because they're they're not old enough, or whatever the reason.
Right. This is like anything else. This only applies. In other words, this only happens to a male who's over 13, meaning it's the manner in which this spiritual unity happens is different for different segments of the population. But this is what happens for the nation when people it happens for the individual who's getting the aliyah, but it's also they effectuate this for the nation. They bring this energy into the world for everybody else who's not getting an aliyah.
I see.
It's like any mitzvah that's specific to a certain population, right? When a woman goes to the mikvah, what is she doing? She's doing the mikvah. It's a personal mitzvah, but she's bringing that energy into the world for everybody else as well. Or when she lights Shabbos candles, or right? It's like that's why everybody needs to be pulling their weight, because all these things happen, but they only happen if everybody's doing the part that they can do. So I don't know. I can't say this with authority, but I would suppose that this is also why the Rebbe. It's been a Chabad custom even from the times of the Alter Rebbe, but our Rebbe, the Friedrich Rebbe, and then our Rebbe made it, an even stronger push for people to learn the weekly section of the parsha every day with Rashi, I would imagine has something to do with this as well, right? That, in other words, learning the weekly Sedra is for everybody, whether or not you're actually getting a physical aliyah to the Torah on Shabbos, you're still connecting to that week's parsha, you're still bringing that energy into that week, you're still effectuating that union of your soul to the Torah. So those are things, and that the Rebbe says very specifically is the term he uses is shava l'kol nefesh. It applies to every single person. So people can do it on, obviously, on very different levels, right? There's, people can do it on a much deeper level, people do it on a much simpler level, but everybody can do it at some level, right? So even like this chitas for kids I was talking about earlier, it's an amazing thing. You can read a summary of that section of Tanya Chumash. It's like a summary, and it's in very simple terms like that children can understand. Not very, whatever. And also they have it orally. They have it done orally, so you can listen in the car if you're driving someplace. Besides the fact that Chabad also has the daily learning that you can do online with the, translation and everything else. So that's another way to make this daily connection to that week's parsha. But we have from the Alter Rebbe talks about how living with the times means living with the parsha of the week, living with its lessons, which is why we keep studying the parsha for 3,000 years. You think like by now we would know it, but it's like it's not just information, it's our life force. It energizes our soul for the week. It's like our spiritual food. So we don't say, well, I had breakfast yesterday, or I know what scrambled eggs are all about. I've had them, so like I don't need to eat them anymore because I ate them enough times in my life, right? It's like, no, well, but I'm hungry now. It's breakfast time, and I'm gonna have whatever, So it's like that same idea. Like it gives, so that part of it, I would suspect, also is effectuated when we learn Torah, when we learn the parsha of the week. This piece, learning the parsha of the week. Of course, there's other ways of learning Torah also. Like right now we're learning Torah, but it's not the parsha of the week. Come to Thursday class, we'll learn the parsha of the week.
Which needs to be longer.
Right. Okay. So anyway, I think we should say chazak, chazak, v'nis chazek.
That's a great journey. This is a great one. This is really good.
Yes. Thank you
There's
so much.
There's one more mimer,
Yeah.
and then there's like somebody's almost like I don't know, memoirs almost of the time here, and then there's a few appendices, and then we'll be done. I don't know. We'll see how long it takes us, but
Hi.
we're nearing the end.
Hi.
Yeah.
So, okay, so just to summarize in my own mind, so an aliyah to the Torah is an aliyah for the soul of that individual, and then that aliyah empowers the soul to fulfill its mission, to, so to speak, like how we're energized by Shabbos itself. So, but that's like an extra boost or something for that soul to carry out its mission throughout the week.
Well, I guess it does, but it's not just that it does. I'm sure that it does do that, but what it seems that the previous Rebbe says is that by itself is a fulfillment of its mission, meaning the fact that that moment itself is a fulfillment as well, not just that it gives it the necessary energy to go into the world afterwards, but that itself is fulfillment of a purpose of the soul, because the soul is saying a bracha on the Torah. Like what that moment, it's a moment of union between the Jew and the Torah. So that moment is by itself a purpose, that union of the soul and the Torah. And I'm comparing it, although I can't say with authority that it's exactly the same thing, to that the Alter Rebbe talks about in Tanya, that anytime a Jew studies Torah, there's a union between the Jew and Torah. This is obviously of a more intense nature because there's a bracha that's being made. So the bracha is being made, and it's a Torah scroll, not just the words of Torah, in a book of Torah. It's actually the Torah scroll. So it's like more intense. But that moment
So when you're saying mission, like we have many parts to our missions here. Like it's just that happens to be in that moment, that's a connection that we're making that our soul's supposed to make.
Yeah, and it
Like
makes it worthy for the soul to have come down into the body because it made a bracha on the Torah. It, like Hashem says, it was worth it for me to put that soul in the world because look, it had an aliyah to the Torah.
I guess when I think of mission, I think of like there's one thing that we're supposed to do and then we're done.
Well, it's not exactly that. It's not exactly that because even that, I'm saying, yeah, it's not exactly that. We have a mission. There could be the Baal Shem Tov says that you never know. A Jew could come down into the world just to do another Jew a favor, one Jew a favor at some point in time. That doesn't mean that there aren't other things along the way he's supposed to accomplish besides that one favor. But here we're talking about, it's like Hashem says, oh, it was worth it for that soul, all that difficulty that soul had to go through to come into the world. It was worth it because he's making an aliyah to the Torah now. Okay, that's what I want to wish everybody to have so tonight and tomorrow is Yitzhak Kislev, so we say that we should have a Lashana Tova, we should have a good year in the learning of Chassidus and in the ways of Chassidus. We should be written and inscribed. So, yeah, there's a Farang, I'm gonna stop the recording.